The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Michelle Thompson hurried to get her 6-year-old daughter ready for school. Living in the modest Pine Grove neighborhood of Cleveland, the 32-year-old single mother had perfected her morning routine over the years. She worked 2 jobs, as a hospital receptionist during the day and a part-time bookkeeper in the evenings, to provide a stable life for her little girl. That Wednesday morning seemed like any other until Michelle noticed she was running 10 minutes behind schedule. Her daughter had been fighting a mild fever the night before, causing them both to oversleep slightly. As she helped her little girl into her favorite purple backpack, Michelle's mind was already racing through the quickest route to drop her daughter at school before heading to work. The familiar drive to Riverside Elementary usually took 15 minutes, but Michelle knew she could make it in 12 if she caught all the green lights. As she merged onto Oak Street, she noticed a police cruiser in her rearview mirror. She double-checked her speed, 32 in a 35 zone, and kept driving, maintaining her usual careful driving style despite her hurry. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed behind her. Michelle's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, knowing she hadn't done anything wrong. She pulled over smoothly, turning into a small shopping plaza parking lot. In her rearview mirror, she saw a young officer step out of the cruiser, probably in his mid-20s, his uniform still carrying that fresh-from-the-academy crispness. "Mommy, why are we stopping?" her daughter's innocent voice came from the back seat. Michelle smiled reassuringly in the rearview mirror. "It's okay, sweetie. The police officer probably just wants to make sure everything's safe." She reached for her license and registration, movements deliberate and calm, just as her father had taught her years ago. The officer approached, his hand resting nervously on his belt. Officer James Richardson had been on the force for exactly 3 months and 2 weeks. His training officer had just signed off on his solo patrol clearance the previous week, and this was only his second traffic stop without supervision. What happened next would spark a chain of events that would shake the community's trust in law enforcement and raise serious questions about police training, racial bias, and the justice system's ability to correct its own mistakes. As Officer Richardson reached Michelle's window, neither of them knew that their interaction would soon make headlines across the state and become a turning point in both their lives. The morning air was crisp, carrying the last hints of winter as Michelle rolled down her window. She could feel her daughter's curious eyes watching from the back seat as Officer Richardson's shadow fell across her door. Her hands remained visible on the steering wheel, her movements measured and respectful. Even as anxiety began to build in her chest. Something about the officer's tense posture and darting eyes told her this wouldn't be a routine traffic stop. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice carrying a slight tremor that Michelle's years of customer service experience immediately picked up on. As she reached for her documents, she couldn't have known that this moment would soon spiral into a nightmare that would test her faith in the system she'd always taught her daughter to trust. As Michelle handed over her documents, she noticed Officer Richardson's hands trembling slightly. His eyes darted between her car's interior and the surrounding parking lot, as if expecting trouble where there clearly was none. The morning sun caught his badge, number 2847, and she made a mental note of it, a habit her father, a retired postal worker, had always encouraged. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Richardson's voice cracked slightly. Michelle maintained her composed demeanor, though confusion was building inside her. "No, officer, I don't. I was driving carefully and under the speed limit." She glanced at her dashboard clock, 8:17 a.m. Her daughter would be late for school, but right now, staying calm was the priority. The young officer's next words caught her completely off guard. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Michelle's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer, may I ask why?" "My daughter is in the back seat, and we're on our way to school." She could hear her little girl shifting nervously in her booster seat. "Ma'am, your vehicle matches the description of one involved in a reported disturbance this morning." Officer Richardson's hand hadn't left his weapon, and his stance grew more rigid. Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. Her reliable gray Honda Civic was possibly the most common car in the city. "Officer, there must be a mistake. I'm a hospital receptionist heading to drop my daughter at school. We're already running late, and I can prove where I work." Michelle reached for her hospital ID badge in her purse, but the officer's reaction was immediate and alarming. "Hands where I can see them," he shouted, drawing his weapon. Michelle's daughter began to cry in the back seat, and the sound pierced Michelle's heart like a knife. "Please, officer, you're frightening my child. I was just reaching for my work ID." 2 more patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing. Michelle's daughter's sobs grew louder, and Michelle felt tears welling up in her own eyes. "Baby, everything's going to be okay," she called to the back seat, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing fear. The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare. Officer Richardson ordered Michelle out of the car, and despite her calm compliance, he roughly handcuffed her in front of her terrified daughter. The other officers who arrived seemed unsure of the situation but deferred to Richardson's lead, a critical mistake that would later come under intense scrutiny. A small crowd had begun to gather outside the shopping plaza's coffee shop. Several bystanders had their phones out, recording the scene. One woman stepped forward, identifying herself as a teacher, and offered to stay with Michelle's daughter. Michelle, fighting back tears, had to make the hardest decision of her life, allowing a stranger to comfort her child while she was being wrongfully arrested. "My phone is in my purse," Michelle told the teacher, her voice shaking but dignified. "Please call my mother, she's listed as the mom in my contacts. Tell her to meet us at the police station and to call Mr. Chen from the legal clinic." The teacher nodded, her own eyes glistening with tears at the injustice unfolding before her. As Officer Richardson led Michelle to his patrol car, she held her head high, even as she heard her daughter's desperate cries for "Mommy." Behind them, the teacher was already dialing Michelle's mother, while other bystanders continued recording documentation that would soon prove invaluable. The morning that had started so normally was about to become a catalyst for change in their community, though none of them knew it yet. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Michelle sat handcuffed to a metal chair in the interview room. Her wrists ached, but her mind was consumed with worry about her daughter. 2 hours had passed since her arrest, and despite her repeated requests, she hadn't been told if her mother had picked up her little girl. Outside the interview room, a more experienced officer, Sergeant Diana Reynolds, was reviewing the incident report with growing concern. A 20-year veteran of the force, she had seen her share of rookie mistakes, but something about this case set off every alarm bell in her mind. The supposed disturbance that prompted the stop was vague at best, a called-in complaint about a gray Honda Civic that had already been resolved at a different location. Meanwhile, in the station's lobby, Michelle's mother, Mrs. Patricia Thompson, had arrived with Mr. Chen, a community legal clinic lawyer who had helped many local families over the years. Michelle's daughter was clinging to her grandmother, finally calm but still occasionally hiccuping from crying. The teacher who had stayed with her had provided a detailed witness statement and her contact information before leaving for school. "This is a clear case of profiling and improper procedure," Mr. Chen said quietly to Patricia, reviewing the shaky cell phone footage that witnesses had already shared on social media. The video was spreading rapidly, gaining thousands of views and shares. Local news vans were beginning to gather outside the police station. Back in the interview room, Sergeant Reynolds finally entered, her face professional but her eyes showing a hint of sympathy. She had already spoken with the witness who had first reported the suspicious gray Honda. It had been involved in a minor parking dispute that morning, but the car's actual description mentioned a dented rear bumper and out-of-state plates. Michelle's car matched neither detail. "Ms. Thompson," Sergeant Reynolds began, her tone measured, "I want to apologize for your extended wait. We're reviewing the circumstances of your arrest, and I have some questions about this morning's events." She noticed Michelle's professional attire, her hospital ID badge still clipped to her blouse, and the obvious signs of a working mother who had done nothing wrong. As Michelle recounted the morning's events, her voice remained steady despite her exhaustion and worry. She described Officer Richardson's escalating behavior, the unnecessary draw of his weapon, and most importantly, the trauma inflicted on her young daughter. Sergeant Reynolds took detailed notes, her frown deepening with each new detail. In another part of the station, Officer Richardson sat with his union representative, trying to justify his actions. But the more he spoke, the more apparent it became that he had acted on unfounded suspicions and poor training. His body camera footage, now being reviewed by Internal Affairs, showed a nervous officer creating danger where none existed. The story was rapidly becoming more than just another arrest gone wrong. Local community leaders had begun arriving at the station, and social media was ablaze with the video of a professional woman being handcuffed in front of her crying child. The hashtag Justice for Michelle was trending in their state. Sergeant Reynolds stepped out of the interview room and conferred briefly with the station captain. Minutes later, she returned with a key to remove Michelle's handcuffs. "Ms. Thompson, you're free to go. We sincerely apologize for this incident." But both women knew a simple apology wouldn't be enough to undo the morning's damage. As Michelle walked into the lobby, her daughter ran into her arms, and she held her tight, tears finally flowing freely. Mr. Chen stepped forward, his expression grave but determined. "Michelle, what happened today was wrong on every level. If you're willing, we need to make sure it doesn't happen to another mother, another child." Michelle looked at her daughter, then at the growing crowd of supporters outside the station, and nodded. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The next few days unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. Michelle's story had struck a chord with people across the country, and the video of her arrest had reached millions of views. While she tried to maintain normalcy for her daughter, attending parent-teacher conferences and helping with homework, their lives had been fundamentally changed. The hospital where Michelle worked had been wonderfully supportive. Her supervisor, Dr. Patel, had not only given her paid time off to deal with the aftermath but had also written a glowing character reference describing her 5 years of exemplary service. "Michelle is the kind of employee who makes everyone's day better," he wrote. "She has never missed a shift and handles difficult situations with remarkable grace." Meanwhile, the police department was facing mounting pressure. Internal Affairs had expedited their investigation, particularly after discovering that Officer Richardson had been involved in 2 other controversial stops in his short time on the force. Both cases involved minority citizens, and both times, his body camera footage showed similar patterns of escalation without cause. Local news stations ran interviews with the teacher who had stayed with Michelle's daughter. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," she told reporters, wiping away tears. Here was this clearly professional woman, trying to take her child to school, being treated like a dangerous criminal. "The little girl's cries will haunt me forever." Mr. Chen had assembled a strong legal team, including civil rights attorney Lisa Ramirez, known for handling high-profile cases of police misconduct. They were preparing not just a legal challenge but a campaign for systemic change in police training and accountability. The police union initially stood behind Officer Richardson, but their support wavered as more evidence emerged. His body camera footage, when compared to witness videos and Michelle's calm demeanor, painted a clear picture of an undertrained officer who had let his biases cloud his judgment. One evening, as Michelle helped her daughter with math homework, she noticed changes in her little girl. Once outgoing and cheerful, she now grew quiet whenever they saw a police car. The child's teacher had reported she seemed withdrawn at school, especially during their community helpers unit. The psychological impact of that morning was becoming clear, and it strengthened Michelle's resolve to seek justice. Community leaders organized a town hall meeting to discuss police training and community relations. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls. When Michelle took the podium, her voice steady and clear, the crowd fell silent. "This isn't just about me," she began. "It's about every parent who has to have the talk with their children about how to survive a police encounter. It's about every child who should be able to trust those sworn to protect them." The police chief, under increasing pressure, announced a comprehensive review of the department's training procedures. Sergeant Reynolds had been appointed to lead a new community oversight committee, and she reached out to Michelle to serve as a civilian advisor. It was a small step, but a significant one. Back at home, Michelle's mother helped maintain their routine, cooking dinner and helping with homework. But late at night, after her daughter was asleep, Michelle would sometimes sit in their small living room, reading the thousands of messages of support she'd received. Many were from other mothers sharing similar stories, though few had been documented as clearly as hers. Mr. Chen and his team were preparing for their first court appearance, but they had already achieved one victory. Officer Richardson had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of all his traffic stops. The department had also announced mandatory retraining for all officers on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias. As Michelle tucked her daughter into bed that night, the little girl asked a question that broke her heart. "Mommy, are all police officers bad?" Michelle held her daughter close, choosing her words carefully. "No, sweetie. There are many good officers who protect people. But when someone makes a big mistake, it's important to make sure it doesn't happen again." She knew the journey ahead would be long, but she was ready to fight for the change their community needed. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and supporters as Michelle walked in for the preliminary hearing. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful morning, and the case had grown far beyond a simple wrongful arrest. Mr. Chen walked beside her, carrying a thick folder of evidence, while Attorney Ramirez led the way through the crowd. Inside the courtroom, Michelle was surprised to see Sergeant Reynolds sitting in the gallery. The veteran officer had become an unexpected ally, providing crucial testimony about departmental procedures that should have prevented the incident. Her presence today wasn't required, but she had chosen to attend. As the hearing began, Judge Howard Bennett, known for his no-nonsense approach, listened intently as Attorney Ramirez presented their case. The evidence was compelling: witness videos, body camera footage, and most damaging, Officer Richardson's own contradictory statements about why he had initiated the stop. "Your Honor," Ramirez began, "what we have here is not just a case of mistaken identity. This is a clear example of how implicit bias and inadequate training can turn a routine morning into a traumatic event for an innocent family." She played the body camera footage, and the courtroom fell silent as they watched the unnecessary escalation unfold. The police department's attorney tried to argue that Officer Richardson had followed protocol based on the reported disturbance, but Judge Bennett's questions quickly exposed the holes in this defense. The original complaint had been about a completely different vehicle, and Richardson had failed to verify any details before escalating the situation. During a brief recess, Michelle sat quietly in the hallway, thinking about her daughter. The child was staying with her grandmother during the hearing, still struggling to process what had happened. The family's therapist had suggested art therapy, and their refrigerator was now covered with drawings, some showing their family happy together, others depicting the scary morning with the police car. Back in session, Mr. Chen presented testimony from Dr. Williams, a respected expert on police training and community relations. "What we see in this case," Dr. Williams explained, "is a perfect storm of inadequate training, unchecked bias, and a system that failed to protect both the citizen and the officer." Officer Richardson was clearly not prepared for independent patrol duties. The most powerful moment came when the teacher who had helped Michelle's daughter took the stand. Her emotional testimony about the child's terror and the unnecessary trauma inflicted on both mother and daughter brought tears to several jurors' eyes. Even the police department's attorney seemed affected by her account. Judge Bennett's questions revealed his growing concern about the broader implications of the case. He asked pointed questions about the department's training procedures, the supervision of rookie officers, and the review process for traffic stops. Each answer seemed to strengthen Michelle's case. As the hearing drew to a close, a surprising development unfolded. Officer Richardson's union representative approached Mr. Chen, indicating that the officer wanted to make a statement. After a brief consultation with his attorneys, Richardson took the stand. His demeanor was markedly different from that morning. Gone was the nervous aggression, replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I made a terrible mistake," Richardson began, his voice shaking. "I let fear and poor training guide my actions, and I caused harm to a family that deserved protection, not persecution. I'm willing to accept the consequences of my actions." His unexpected testimony shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, with community members holding signs supporting both police reform and Michelle's case. Local news cameras captured every moment, and social media buzzed with updates from inside the courthouse. What had started as one mother's wrongful arrest was becoming a catalyst for change in police training and community relations. As the hearing concluded, Judge Bennett announced he would review all evidence before making his ruling the following week. Michelle walked out of the courthouse feeling both exhausted and hopeful. Whatever the outcome, she knew her case was shining a light on issues that had been in the shadows for too long. The week leading up to Judge Bennett's ruling felt like the longest of Michelle's life. She tried to maintain her normal routine, but the weight of anticipation hung over everything. Her daughter had started sleeping in her bed again, plagued by nightmares about that morning. The child's therapist assured her this was normal, but it broke Michelle's heart to see her usually confident little girl so shaken. The case had sparked widespread discussion about police reform. Local news stations ran special reports on police training programs, and the city council had scheduled emergency meetings to discuss new oversight measures. Michelle's story had become a tipping point for long-simmering community concerns. At work, Michelle found unexpected support from her patients. Many shared their own stories of encounters with law enforcement, some dating back decades. An elderly patient, Mrs. Rivera, tearfully recounted a similar incident from 30 years ago. "But back then," she said, squeezing Michelle's hand, "nobody would have believed us. No cameras, no witnesses willing to speak up. You're fighting for all of us." The police department was already implementing changes, not waiting for the judge's ruling. Sergeant Reynolds had been promoted to lead a new training division, focusing on de-escalation techniques and community relations. She'd reached out to Michelle several times, seeking input on how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Officer Richardson's testimony had created ripples through the department. Several other rookie officers had come forward about feeling unprepared for solo patrol, leading to a complete overhaul of the training program. The police union, initially defensive, was now working with community leaders to develop new guidelines for traffic stops. Mr. Chen and attorney Ramirez spent long hours preparing for the ruling. They had achieved their primary goal, systemic change, but the official ruling would set an important precedent. The legal team had received calls from civil rights organizations across the country, all watching the case closely. The evening before the ruling, Michelle sat with her mother and daughter at their kitchen table, sharing a meal just as they had done every week before the incident. Her daughter had drawn a new picture at school, this time showing her mother in a superhero cape, standing up to make things right. "Are you scared about tomorrow, Mommy?" she asked, pushing her peas around her plate. Michelle considered the question carefully. "A little," she admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what's right even when you're scared." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand, proud of the strength her daughter had shown throughout the ordeal. Later that night, Michelle received an unexpected call from the teacher who had helped her daughter during the arrest. She had started a support group for families affected by similar incidents, and the response had been overwhelming. "Your case gave people hope," she told Michelle. "It showed them that speaking up can make a difference." The media coverage had evolved too. What started as sensational headlines about a traffic stop gone wrong had become thoughtful discussions about community policing and institutional change. Local journalists had investigated similar incidents, revealing patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. As Michelle prepared for bed that night, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just a few weeks. Her daughter's drawings now included police officers helping people, not just scary ones. The therapy sessions were helping them both process the trauma. And most importantly, their community had come together in ways she never expected. She checked her phone one last time before sleep. Messages of support flooded her inbox, from other mothers, community leaders, and even police officers who wanted to see positive change. Tomorrow's ruling would be important, but Michelle realized that the real victory was already won. Their story had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored, and changes were happening. As she drifted off to sleep, Michelle heard her daughter's quiet breathing from the next room, finally feeling secure enough to sleep in her own bed again. Whatever Judge Bennett decided tomorrow, they had already made a difference. The system that had failed them was being rebuilt, and their community was stronger for it. The morning of Judge Bennett's ruling dawned clear and bright. The courthouse steps were already crowded by 7 a.m., with supporters holding signs and local news crews setting up their equipment. Inside, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation as Michelle and her legal team prepared for the hearing. This time, Michelle's daughter stayed home with her grandmother, working on a special art project her therapist had suggested, drawing what she hoped would happen today. The little girl had been showing signs of healing, though she still asked tough questions about justice and fairness that sometimes left her mother searching for answers. The courtroom filled quickly. Sergeant Reynolds was there again, along with several other officers who had supported the call for reform. The police chief himself had arrived, his presence signaling the department's recognition of the case's importance. Officer Richardson sat with his union representative, looking notably different from the aggressive young officer of that morning weeks ago. Community leaders filled the gallery, including Pastor Johnson from the local church and Dr. Patel from the hospital. The teacher who had helped Michelle's daughter now sat with a group of other educators who had started advocating for better police-community relations in schools. Local civil rights activists who had been fighting for police reform for years watched with cautious optimism. Judge Bennett entered the courtroom precisely at 9 a.m., his expression giving nothing away. The room fell silent as he took his seat and began to speak. "Before I deliver my ruling," he began, "I want to acknowledge the broader implications of this case. What happened to Ms. Thompson and her daughter represents not just an individual failure, but a systemic one." He continued, detailing how the evidence had revealed multiple points where better training, proper supervision, or clearer protocols could have prevented the incident. He praised the police department's proactive response in implementing changes but emphasized that more work was needed. Officer Richardson's actions that morning reflected not just his own inexperience and bias, but also failures in training, supervision, and departmental culture, Judge Bennett stated. However, his subsequent acknowledgement of these failures and willingness to participate in reform efforts must also be considered. The judge then turned his attention to Michelle. "Ms. Thompson, your dignity and determination throughout this ordeal have been remarkable. You had every right to be angry, to seek punitive damages, to demand retribution. Instead, you chose to focus on preventing similar incidents from happening to other families. Your advocacy for systematic change rather than personal vengeance is commendable." The courtroom remained silent as Judge Bennett shifted in his seat, preparing to deliver his ruling. Michelle felt her heart racing but maintained her composure, thinking of her daughter's hopeful drawings at home. Mr. Chen placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "In light of all evidence and testimony presented, this court rules that the arrest of Michelle Thompson was unlawful and violated her civil rights," Judge Bennett declared. "The court orders the following. First, all records of this arrest will be expunged immediately. Second, the police department must expand and accelerate its announced reforms, with quarterly progress reports to this court. He continued, "Third, Officer Richardson will be required to complete comprehensive retraining before any consideration of returning to active duty. Fourth, the department must establish a civilian oversight committee, with Ms. Thompson offered a position should she choose to accept it." The judge's voice grew stronger as he addressed the broader implications. "Finally, this court recognizes that monetary compensation cannot fully address the trauma inflicted on Ms. Thompson and her daughter. However, the settlement proposed by the city, including funding for community policing initiatives and youth programs, represents a meaningful step toward healing and reform." As Judge Bennett concluded his ruling, the courtroom remained silent for a moment before erupting in murmured discussions. Michelle closed her eyes briefly, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The ruling wasn't just a victory for her family, it was a mandate for real change. The hours following Judge Bennett's ruling were a whirlwind of emotion and activity. As Michelle stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Supporters hugged each other, some wiping away tears. Local news reporters rushed forward, their cameras capturing what would become iconic images of justice served. But Michelle's first thought was of her daughter. She pulled out her phone, calling home where her mother and little girl were waiting. "We did it, baby," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "The judge said we helped make things better for everyone." Her daughter's excited squeal brought the first real smile to her face since entering the courthouse that morning. Inside the building, Sergeant Reynolds approached Michelle with an unexpected proposition. "We're forming a new community outreach unit," she explained. "We need people who understand both sides of this issue, people who can help us rebuild trust. Would you consider being part of our training program?" The offer represented exactly the kind of systemic change Michelle had hoped to inspire. Officer Richardson, who had remained quiet throughout the ruling, asked to speak with Michelle privately. In a small conference room, away from the cameras and crowd, he struggled to find the right words. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said finally. "But I want you to know that you've changed how I see everything about police work. Your dignity through all of this, it taught me more than any training ever could." Mr. Chen and Attorney Ramirez were already discussing next steps with civil rights organizations. The judge's ruling had set a precedent that could affect police departments nationwide. "This case proves that change is possible when communities stand together," Mr. Chen told reporters. "But it's just the beginning. We need to ensure these reforms are implemented and maintained." As Michelle left the courthouse, she noticed Dr. Patel waiting by her car. Her boss had tears in his eyes as he hugged her. "The hospital board met this morning," he said. "We're establishing a support program for families affected by trauma from police encounters. We'd like you to help shape it, if you're willing." The ripples of change were spreading further than she had imagined. Back at home, Michelle found her daughter had created a wall of artwork, dozens of drawings showing police officers helping people, families feeling safe, and her mother making things better. The last drawing showed their whole community holding hands in a circle. "My teacher says we're learning about civic responsibility next week," her daughter announced proudly. "She asked if you would come talk to our class." That evening, as news of the ruling spread, Michelle's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support and thanks. Other mothers shared stories of how her case had given them courage to speak up about their own experiences. Community leaders reached out about joining various initiatives for police reform and community healing. The local police department held a press conference where the chief announced immediate changes in training protocols. Sergeant Reynolds would head the new Community Relations Unit, with civilian oversight including input from Michelle and other community members. The department was already scheduling sensitivity training sessions and revising their protocols for traffic stops. As Michelle tucked her daughter into bed that night, in her own room, for the first time in weeks, the little girl asked a question that brought tears to her eyes. "Mommy, did we help make the world better today?" Michelle sat on the edge of the bed, stroking her daughter's hair. "Yes, baby, we did. And you know what? We're going to keep making it better, one day at a time. Later, sitting alone in her living room, Michelle reflected on how far they'd come from that terrifying morning. The trauma wasn't completely healed, they still had work to do with their therapist, but they had transformed their pain into purpose. The changes being implemented would protect other families from going through what they had experienced. A text message from Sergeant Reynolds lit up her phone. Training committee meets next Tuesday. Ready to help us do better? Michelle smiled as she typed her response, count me in. The work wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. 6 months after Judge Bennett's ruling, the changes in the community were visible and profound. On a bright autumn morning, Michelle stood before a graduating class of police cadets, sharing her story not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. The training center's walls displayed new posters about community policing and de-escalation techniques, direct results of the reforms her case had sparked. Her daughter sat in the front row, beaming with pride as she watched her mother speak. The little girl had become something of a mascot for the department's youth outreach program, helping other children understand that police officers could be trusted allies when properly trained and supervised. Her own healing journey had become an inspiration for other families working through similar traumas. Sergeant Reynolds, now Captain Reynolds, had transformed the department's training programs. New officers spent more time in community engagement before ever conducting traffic stops. The changes had already shown promising results. Civilian complaints were down 60%, and community trust surveys showed marked improvement. Officer Richardson had completed his retraining and counseling program. Though he chose not to return to patrol duty, he found his calling in the department's new Community Relations Division, where his experience served as a powerful teaching tool for other officers. His honest acknowledgement of his mistakes and commitment to change had earned him unexpected respect from both colleagues and community members. The Hospital Support Program for Families Affected by Police Encounters, which Michelle helped design, had become a model for other cities. Dr. Patel frequently hosted healthcare professionals from around the country who wanted to implement similar programs in their communities. Sometimes the best healing happens when we help others heal, he often said, quoting Michelle's words from their first planning meeting. In her daughter's school, the Community Helpers unit had been completely redesigned with input from parents, teachers, and law enforcement. Children learned about their rights while also understanding the important role of properly trained police officers. The artwork on the classroom walls showed a more nuanced, realistic view of community-police relations, reflecting the ongoing work of building trust. Mr. Chen and Attorney Ramirez had taken their success to other communities, helping implement similar reforms across the state. Their case had become required reading in law schools, not just for its legal precedent, but for how it demonstrated the power of combining legal action with community advocacy. The Civilian Oversight Committee, where Michelle now served as vice chair, had become an integral part of police department operations. Their quarterly meetings, once tense affairs, had evolved into productive sessions where officers and community members worked together to address concerns before they became crises. That morning, as Michelle concluded her presentation to the cadets, she shared a final thought that captured the journey of the past 6 months. The badge you'll wear represents both power and responsibility. Your actions can either build trust or break it. Remember my story not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that when we acknowledge our mistakes and commit to doing better, real change is possible. After the presentation, Michelle's daughter ran up to hug her, wearing the junior police badge that Captain Reynolds had given her, a symbol of how far they'd come from that terrifying morning. The little girl no longer flinched at the sight of police cars. Instead, she often waved to the officers who now regularly visited her school for community engagement programs. As they walked to their car, they passed the department's newly installed community bulletin board, filled with photos of joint police community events and success stories of the new training programs. Michelle's case had its own section, not highlighting the incident itself, but celebrating the positive changes it had inspired. That evening, at their regular family dinner, Michelle's mother raised a toast, to making the world better, one brave step at a time. Michelle's daughter chimed in, and to helping other people be brave too. Michelle smiled, thinking of how their personal tragedy had transformed into community triumph. As the sun set on another day of progress, Michelle received a text from Captain Reynolds about next week's training session. The work continued, but now it was work of hope and healing, of building bridges and strengthening bonds. Their story had become more than just a cautionary tale. It was proof that justice, when combined with compassion and commitment to change, could transform a community.